Ramp Druid. This is one of the most defensive decks in the format, as you can see, because there's quite a few minions with taunt in it, and the mana cost is really high. The idea of this deck is rather simple as well. Step 1, try to hold on to the board. Zombie Chow helps a lot with that. Wrath, Swipe, Keeper, Shredder, Shield Master, all of those tend to be able to at least 1-for-1 against early game minions. And then in the late game, your cards will all 2-for-1 your opponent just because they're so powerful. We're looking at cards like Ancient of War, Sylvanas, Ancient of Lore, Kel'Thuzad, Cenarius. The reason why this deck is called Ramp is because ideally you play turn 2 Wild Growth, and then you ramp your mana up from there. Innervate into something big will stop an aggressive deck cold. This deck is really good against aggressive decks because it has so much taunt. Notable cards that aren't in this deck include Dr. Boom. The reason why I have chosen not to include Dr. Boom in this deck, and you may choose to put it in yours, is it would be the only card that would be hit by Big Game Hunter. Many people are running Big Game Hunter, so with a deck this low, I figure not running it is appropriate. Another set of cards that this deck isn't running is Force of Nature and Savage Roar. There are some versions of this deck which do run Force of Nature and Savage Roar, and aren't quite the mid-range Druid also. For those, you would basically have a hybrid between that deck and this deck. And as usual, if the meta isn't actually very aggressive, you can consider trying to remove the Chow. If there aren't that many weapons, you can consider not running Harrison. If there are a lot of big minions, you can consider running 2 Big Game Hunter. If there are a lot of minions, you can consider running Mind Control Tech.
I must protect the wild. Nature will rise against you.
Druid versus Druid. This tends to be a matchup which will go into the late game. If he is the version with Force of Nature Savage Roar, then it's usually a whole bunch of trading in the middle game, and then your taunts versus their combo. In the early game, you're pretty much always looking for the early game, that being Zombie Chow, Innervate, Wild Growth, Wrath, Shade, and sometimes when you have Innervate, you're looking for more exotic cards along with it. The Wrath doesn't do much in this, so I'm going to just toss it away.
My greetings.
If I had a better hand, or a hand with more plays, I would have likely done the hero ability instead. Most of the cards from the Druid are a bit too big for Wrath to handle, so might as well try to get a better card with it. That's the nice flexibility of Wrath. Also worth mentioning that I wouldn't keep Wrath against a deck that I would consider to be a later game deck. An early Shade of Naxxramas is extremely helpful for all the Druids. Let it just sit there and it'll grow. With this deck, more often than not, it's best to use the Shade of Naxxramas to trade into something much later on. Really important to consider the Innervate usage in this deck. One sample play that some might consider right now is Innervate Sylvanas, but the problem is that takes away the curve in the future. I will be going with Innervate Ancient of War the next turn, into Sylvanas behind it afterwards. So on this turn, the question is to Keeper of the Grove that for 2 damage, or to hold off. And I'll make the call to do this.
I must safeguard. I wait for no one.
for I don't quite know how fast or slow his deck is yet, and I do want to keep some semblance of having something on the board against his Innervate start. There are some key targets in the matchup to silence. For example, Sylvanas, if he's running Ancient of War, then Ancient of War. But it's possible that the opponent doesn't run Ancient of War, and a threat that early kind of wants to be handled. Since I can stay on curve, I think I will.
Where shall I strike?
And since this looks to be a reasonable play against Big Game Hunter, no need for something quite that big yet, Ancient of War. Even though the opponent played a Big Game Hunter, Ancient of War is almost always still better in taunt mode. The opponent's made a very slow play there with wrathing for a card. So his hand must not be very good. Interesting. Coinwild's Growth. Going to turn 7. Turn 7 tends to be a turn in which they will play Ancient of Lore, or maybe Ancient of War. I will play Sylvanas here, and I think I will also attack. The thing to think about is why would he play a Wild Growth there? And it's probably in order to play something that costs 7 mana.
I have no
2 silence targets here, might as well reveal this then. Oh, and Dr. Boom, that's a card that costs 7 as well. We all know the lovable guy. Okay, in this case, this is going to be one of the rare times where I'll push for damage, because it doesn't look like he has anything that'll be too favorable if I make him do the trades. One consideration at first was something like sending the 6/6 in there, and then hero ability, and then kill it. Another possibility is killing this, hero ability, killing that, and then sending the Sylvanas in there. That actually is starting to sound even better. So I'll actually do that.
Time waits for no one.
I'll take the guaranteed steal.
For the wild.
I'll take it. It speaks to how slow this deck is. Even though the 11 damage to his face is very tantalizing, it puts him down to 11. This deck has absolutely no burst in it other than swipe. I was also itching to use the previous cards because both of those were quite vulnerable to silence, which he hasn't used yet.
I must safeguard the land.
I'm not going to entirely say whether or not it was good or bad to do that series of exchanges, but it does fit the style of the deck to do so. The more risky play of attacking his face may have also paid off. It's possible. In general, if you can play Ancient of War or Ancient of Lore, it tends to be better to play Ancient of War, unless you have a specific read that they have a silence. Because you'll want to play the stronger cards first, and then play into the card draw cards.
I must safeguard the land.
Ancient of Lore is your absolute best friend in the late game. And a hand like this is looking very strong right now. Control versus control usually comes out to who draws into, well, if you draw into the Ancient of Lore, and can keep going as a result. This deck, Ramtru, tends to just be able to keep going even without the Ancient of Lore quite often because its cards cost so much mana that you can often only play one each turn. It's worth also mentioning that I played that Zombie Chow, even though it was kind of late. And it is correct to do so, because This is a very non-violent deck. It'll go into the late game all the time, and any board presence is usually welcome. I think I'll go Ancient of Lore into Piloted Shredder here. And then try to finish him with the Cenarius.
I have no time for games.
Who dares defile this ancient?
Nifty. Alright, Warlock.
Your soul shall be mine.
Mulligan assuming it's Zoo, because if you assume it's anything else, then they'll usually get you in time. The Innervate is a great draw. One of the best possible openings is Innervate Keeper of the Grove against Zoo. Buys you a lot of tempo. This is a very rampy hand. Against Zoo, it turns out that ramping on turn 2 is often still good, because you will have enough time. I would actually consider keeping all 3 cards if this hand were dealt to me against Warlock. More sane might be to replace the Wild Growth, but I'm adventurous, and I can taste the mana.
The light protects me.
Alright, it is Zoo. Off to a slowish start, so that's good for me. This is good because even if he does have Power Overwhelming, which would be unfortunate for me, I do have Azure Drake, Innervate, Wrath coming up.
Why do you call?
And he doesn't have it. Perfect. This is possibly going to be a game where it's an example of if you do get the ramp, you can out-ramp aggressive decks. There's like 2 ways to beat them. One, you out-ramp them and you actually just play 4, 5, 6, 7. The other is you just keep on them with like a 1, 2, 3, 4 play. You play Zombie, Chow, you Wrath, you Shade, you Senjin. Looking good though. And to complete the ramp, I also have Thorsan. A little too much mana. And here's where I hope to draw into Ancient of Lore, Ancient of War, Kel'Thuzad, Sylvanas, Cenarius, the big things at the end.
Why do you call?
It's still possible to lose if I end up not drawing into those things. This turn is still quite good though. Wild Growth is planned to be used at turn 10. Oh, alright. That'll do it. So yeah, against Aggression, it's actually rather straightforward. You continue to play really mana efficiently, and hopefully you do get to ramp or you do get to stave off the aggression before you die. See, that'll look like this deck is so awesome in the edit. That's the power of media. And then people will play the deck and then they'll match up against tempo mage, and then they'll lose, and they'll be like, Trump, this deck sucks. And then I'll be like, oh yeah, I actually had a less than 50% win rate, but I only showed the wins.